problem of what are we actually doing and contributing with. And when I feel, as you do in Sweden, sometimes a bit gloomy and dark and so on, then I'm thinking that we are close to the near end of scholarship, at least if we are not careful. Meaningful social research, I mean, economic management, social research in general, state of the art is something that we should be interested in. And of course, we have more and more research and ever expansion of publications. So one would assume that we all the time contribute enormously to human knowledge, and for that issues around management, organization, the economies, working life and so on would be solved. But the problem is that sometimes we have the experience that we contribute less and less. And sometimes, like in EGOS, European Group of Organization Studies, 2015, I felt at the third day of a conference that I could cite Churchill. Never before in human history have so many, the audience, 400 people there, had so little to say to so few. That all this enormous amount of research doesn't necessarily tell that much. And we have the problem of massification of higher education. I don't know if it's a problem, but it's at least mixed blessing. So with massification of higher education, we also get massification of research. Particularly in areas like business and management, because we have so many students and there's a lot of competition for them. So therefore, we are very much into issues like credentials, rankings, and with increased bureaucratization of our institutions, people are more and more focused on career possibilities. So sometimes I feel that the entire logic governing us is one of employability. Employability, it's a new concept I've coined. It means that you are employ metrics and promotable. So this is the primary logic that a lot of people and our institutions then are characterized by. And one way of put this is to say that we have moved, I'm not idealizing the past, but I still think we have moved from people being interested in research, in the open exploration search for interesting aspects and dimensions and exploring unknown territories, to become more and more focused on ROI search. ROI search means return on investment search. Return on investment search. And the logic is then to get published. Not necessarily say something new, interesting, writing beautiful text or anything, but get published. That is the key element. And publications then have moved from being a means, as an outlet for having something to say, something that through the review and comment process can increase the quality of the work. Now that's become the end. It's not like the beginning of the end, but it's the end. I managed to get published. If anybody reads it, well, who cares or knows, but I managed to get published. And this means that we tend to cultivate ourselves and other people very much as journal-producing technicians. Not as scholars with a broader intellectual interest in relationship to what we do, but journal-producing technicians. And I could say that it's fine with all this journal publishing. The alternative is kind of nepotism, more laissez-faire, or people can do what they want. So there's a logic, of course, attached to the journal publication regimes, but there are also enormous amount of complaints about this, particularly in organization studies, which is my field. That people find research papers often quite formulaic. They are very kind of narrow, very incremental, and people write for their small sub-communities in academia, the micro-tribes. And it means that you have a rather narrow logic as guiding you. And contemporary academia, with all the specialization, with all our rituals, with all the peculiar formulas for writing up stuff, means that we sometimes perhaps could be seen as a hothouse of functional stupidity. Hothouse of functional stupidity. As you may notice, I'm not normally winning any popularity context because I like to be a bit more critical and provocative, and I think that is very important then to stimulate reflexivity in relationship to what we are doing. And that means that you sometimes turn logic upside down. So normally we have like the success recipe for individual researchers. Being specific, position yourself within a particular field, do gap spotting, and incrementally pump out papers, and make sure that you are compliant with reviewers' demands. This is the success recipe for a lot of young and also old people, but it also tends to be the explanation for us having rather little to say to people outside the small micro tribes that we are identifying ourselves with and locating our work within. So our interest, mine and Gabriel and Paulson's, is very much, can we move back more into meaning and meaningful research? What is then meant by meaning? Well, it means that research, it should be comprehensible, not full of jargons and a lot of academic kind of writing that is there in order to just make people in your own exotic sub-tribe happy, but it should be understandable and so on. It should be relevant concerns, not necessarily for one single small business somewhere, but broadly relevant for at least some people outside academia. Could be practitioners, could be educated public or whatever. It should be valid, it should be some empirical support and be seen as credible and making sense in relationship to one's experiences of the world out there. But above, it should be an intellectual contribution. It should means that you say something new. You add an important, or at least some kind of finding that is relevant to understand something a bit better, or you add concept, a line of reasoning, you challenge dominant assumptions and ideas or whatever, but there's an intellectual contribution. So the people that may read your research report may become a bit smarter. Hopefully, or at least think a bit differently or less stupid, or whatever you aim to accomplish. So we have different spheres of meaningfulness, meaning and meaningfulness. It's not the same, but the terms tend to be a bit related. So we have the ego. I'm doing this because I'm so interested in this, a perverse interest in what, and therefore I'm doing this. I want to have my PhD because then my mother-in-law will not look that angrily at me next time we meet, or I impress my neighbors or whatever. And that's fine with some ego commitment to the work, but sometimes it's not even that. I just want to be finished. I'm only doing this because I want to be employable or promotable or whatever. So it's not necessarily so meaningful. And sometimes I have the feeling that a lot of people are more and more cynical about what we do and what they are engaged in themselves in terms of research. The group, the micro-tribe, it's good if you have some people out there that are academically oriented and interested. Hopefully not a very small group or none at all. I mean, a lot of papers that nobody is citing at all. But we have the public, the educated public, practitioners, companies, or whatever, and these tend to be marginalized by contemporary academia because we are so much stuck into the journal publication regimes. We do research partly because we need to reproduce our institutions. This is a university where you have to do research because otherwise it looks bad. This is the logic that we're engaged in. And I'm not the only person that is kind of a bit grumpy about these things, but this is a testimony from J.C. Spender, well-known management professor, says that I see very few people doing work they find important for anything but the tenure and promotion treadmill. This seems less a matter of personal or professional choice than the way our professionalization projects clamp down on our sense of purpose. So a lot of people then experience the situation like that. And a lot of workshops, activities that we do tend to cultivate rather instrumental and opportunistic orientations. This is a citation from a description of an event where a famous professor talked about his research and gave good career advice. And after some time, people became a bit fed up with all this kind of instrumentalization, how to get famous and blah, 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 and then asked, what drives you in your research? What makes you feel engaged? And then the disappointing answer was that to get more citations than my boss, of course, I compete with him after all. And why should taxpayers pay money for this, you may ask? But this is the logic that at least part of the time is present and dominating. So I would say that as social scientists, we need to be read. We need to have an audience. We need to do research with ideas, empirical material, and texts that make people want to read this. They can still be a bit difficult and demanding, but they should not be so formulaic and standardized so that they tend to be off-putting for students and others and so on. So an academic work tends to be very jargon-filled. This is from one of my co-authors. This is in his published journal paper and the original text, and then it's a translation. This is what it actually means. And sometimes I had the feeling that most of the stuff that we do could be expressed much briefer, much clearer, and much more helpful for a reader. But that is not necessarily what we tend to do. We hide behind a lot of jargon and other things. All right, what to do then is perhaps the question that some of you may ask. And I asked myself, my co-authors has asked this question. We need to think through this in terms of implications on different levels. Identity implications, who am I, what do I accomplish, should I really do research, do I think that I can come up with something interesting and relevant to do, can I come up with an idea, do I have rich kind of interesting data, not just milking a database, going out there and interview 20 people, 1 hour each, but to have something that is a bit more perhaps qualified and allow for new insights and so on. And is the text well written? And my experience is that few people have an idea, most people don't have rich material, and few people are not particularly good authors. So this is what we need to work with in relationship to how we see ourselves, but also in relationship to social interactions and implications. Is this research worth a nurse or teacher less? It's a question you can ask yourself all the time. We can institutionalize seminar cultures with questions such as, so what? On the organizational level, we can then try to think much more, how can we support other orientations than dominating? We can have idea generation workshops, perhaps supported by a glass of wine or 2 beers or whatever is called for break out of the constrained lines of thinking. You can have writing workshops, invite good authors and give advice and work with text, not for academic journal publishing, but for writing text that people like to read. One could have policy implications. Institutions could be assessed on, do you have any like real contributions, not only the metric stuff. For example, one could ask schools to single out 5 or 10 key contributions every 5th or whatever year, and then you have a panel looking through this and assessing them. Is there really something here that kind of adds significantly to human knowledge and add to something? I jump over a couple of points here. I just make some marketing for our own approach to how to do interesting research, which I think is lacking. And it mainly means that you identify the dominant implicit assumptions within a particular field. you articulate them, and then you challenge them and come up with counter assumptions. This is the key, according to research, on what is seen as interesting. Most people who do this, they tend to reproduce dominant taking for granted assumptions. And that means that the typical response will be, this is a bit boring, this is a bit trivial. So we can work with methodologies going against then dominant trends that tends to be a bit more perhaps interesting and are more inclined to reach an audience without necessarily having a particular popular message. We've written about this, Alvesson and Sandberg, in constructing research questions. If one only would like to have a look at the article, that's in Academy of Management Review 2011. So, conclusion. Rather brief than brilliant. An ex-rector here at Lund University said, and I think that's sometimes wise, rather brief than brilliant. I think that he was referring to dinner speeches, probably heard too many of these, but I follow his line here, being instructed to do so by the nice organizers of this conference. So, conclusion. We live in an age of mass education, and that tends to bring mass research where everybody, being a lecturer or whatever, should do research. It's a very peculiar idea. So much is being said already. It's difficult to have something novel to come up with. It's fine if you work with a PhD, but then one should be a bit careful about allocating a lot of resources to research, particularly in management studies, perhaps. And one should not push everybody to do this. It's better that people read more and write less. So in academia, we have the problem of many authors and few readers. It's a bit like in art, in theater. A lot of people like to be actors, not so many are interested in being in an audience. So we need to have a rebalance here. So, and also to work with new ideas. Of course, those that are interested in making the effort, reading quite a lot, talking with people, doing ambitious empirical work, being a bit more risk-taking, then you may work with ideas, but that is very tricky indeed. And then it calls for creativity and imagination, which not all of us have all the time, but we can perhaps stimulate it a bit more through seminar cultures and through organizations then supporting us. And if one is interested in a specific methodology to solve some of these problems to some extent, I do think that the assumption challenging methodology that was hinted at before, you identify and then challenge some implicit assumptions in your field. That's the way to go ahead. But we have an enormous amount of research that are just accepting and reproducing dominant implicit assumptions. And that partly accounts for us being a bit boring. It's not so easy to get your intelligent neighbor or even your third-year students to read your research results. But I think we really should manage to do a bit more than that. So this is the audience at Igos, where I imitated Churchill, never before, etc. So they looked a bit happy with that. Hopefully you behind the screens are not too miserable about this talk. If I should just end on a more happy note, we did a serious effort to write something interesting, the stupidity paradox. Alvesson and Spice a couple of years ago, and every week I get a mail from people having read that book. So I think that sometimes you may be lucky and come up with a good idea. This is about stupidity dominating organizations increasingly, and we show how that works and why that is often supported, including in academia. So sometimes you may be able to reach a broad audience, and this is what we should strive for. Not all of us, but our institutions should support initiatives in that direction. So I overstepped my time, so perhaps this was more brilliant and brief, but still I rest my case and then see if there are some questions or angry outbursts or whatever. So I can't see any responses here. There are no questions or comments, anything now. Something popped up here. Slightly ambiguous concept here, phenomena, which I can talk endlessly about. We have a paper on the phenomenon, but I don't know exactly how to answer that question. Thank you is the clarification here. Any other questions or? Yes, now they pop up here. Any suggestions for crossing or bridging these academic tribes? Yeah, I do think it's a good thing to be careful about the we. It's very easy then, I belong to this group, I read these journals, I go to that bloody conference and so on. I mean, the same type of conference all the time. I cultivate my networks and I'm well known in these circles, but then I have no idea what others are doing. I don't think it's good if one kind of move around a bit. It's slightly more nomadic. Try to read something at random. Make some connections to other disciplines or at least other subgroups. You may do this when you have visitors. Can you co-organize something with another group? Can one use more courses, reading groups or whatever, where people have an interest outside then the sub-tribe? Here's a great thinker, Michel Foucault or whatever, or some people interested in reading some of the stuff and discussing that. So you can do a lot of things there in order to bridge our small social cages that we otherwise increasingly are into. Yeah, no, I think it's interesting to Thierry Tartarin here is suggesting that the best idea which never made it. That could be interesting. Have you asked people what are you most proud of in terms of ideas or contributions, not necessarily outcomes? And I don't think there's a clear relationship between a good idea and a successful publication. I have one friend, she published in Academy of Management Journal, and she said that was the worst paper she's ever written because she was forced to follow reviewers. And she was at that time in a situation where she needed a job, and she was coming from Asia and problems in staying in the United States. So she was extremely compliant and really cynical and bitter about this. So good ideas, good papers, not necessarily successful ones. I think that was something we could promote. Another question, do you foresee a collapse of the current academic system? I don't know. I think that sometimes politicians and the kids paying high fees, they should start to ask themselves, why are we paying all this money for academics doing a lot of research that just makes them uninterested and in us and irrelevant for education? Of course, some teaching some research is very relevant for teaching. I would say that all the stuff that I do, it tends to be relevant for teaching. So a lot of it's used in not necessarily course books, but kind of second books in courses and so on. And the students really like it. So like the stupidity paradox that I was shamelessly advocating here. But otherwise, it's the risk that it will break down. People will see through business schools and see through the research part of this unless we shape up and are a bit more careful in what we do and how much money and resources we pay into this. Otherwise, I do think that we tend to just continue then with our success formulas internally unless the market or the external world really disrupt this from us. Yeah, McDonaldization of research. I just think that that's a good expression. McDonaldization of research. I read a piece by quoted in the book by a former editor of a large journal. He said that contemporary, including his own journal, publish articles that are like black cats in a coal cellar. You can't, dark coal cellar, you can't distinguish them from each other. They look the same kind of formula. Of course, the content is a bit different, but we do have some tendencies to the methodization of research, original thinking, some unexpected insights, well-crafted text, a bit outside what most people tend to do, because we are inspired and encouraged to imitate others. This is the success formula. We imitate that rather than try to do something that is a bit different and original, hopefully, perhaps then more interesting to read. So, I think that was the questions, and perhaps back to our sponsor.
Okay, thank you for your